The night my mother raised her glass and said my name, I already knew I was about to lose something I could never get back. I'm not talking about love. That had been rationed for years. I'm talking about position, place, the quiet, unspoken right to exist without having to earn oxygen. My name is Natalie Harper. I was 32 that winter, divorced, employed solvent, and apparently still expendable. The words came wrapped in crystal and candlelight. That's the part people don't warn you about. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles, clears its throat, and waits for silence before it speaks. It was Christmas Eve in Ridgewood, Connecticut. My parents' house sat on a hill with a long, circular drive, the kind of place realtors describe as legacy property. I grew up there. I learned to ride a bike on that driveway. I learned to disappear in that living room. That night, the house was full. My younger sister Claire had just gotten engaged. Again, this time to a man my parents actually approved of. Evan Whitmore, private equity, old money adjacent. The kind of last name that made my father stand straighter without realizing it. I arrived 10 minutes early, like I always did. Early enough to help. Early enough not to be accused of drifting in late with excuses. I brought wine. A good bottle, not showy, just correct. My mother, Judith, kissed my cheek and immediately reached for the bottle to inspect the label. She nodded once satisfied and handed it to the caterer without saying thank you. That was normal. The dining room looked staged, not festive. 12 place settings, name cards, my sister's name written in a thicker pen than mine. I noticed things like that. I always had. My father, Leonard, stood near the fireplace, talking to Evan about interest rates and land development. Claire hovered beside them, hand locked around Evan's arm, her engagement ring catching the light every time she laughed. She laughed a lot that night. No one asked how my drive was. No one asked about my job. I worked in compliance for a regional medical firm, not glamorous, but stable. I had been promoted 3 months earlier. I hadn't mentioned it yet. I was waiting for the right moment. I was still waiting when we sat down. Dinner moved like a script. Compliments. Toasts to Claire and Evan. Stories about Evan's parents' vineyard in Napa. My mother beamed as if she'd personally arranged the weather. Halfway through the main course, my aunt mentioned how nice it must be to have such a big family gathering again. My mother smiled and said, yes, especially now that everything is finally settled. I felt that word land wrong. Settled. She stood up then, tapped her spoon gently against her glass. The room quieted. I remember thinking she looked pleased with herself. Not emotional, not nervous, just prepared. This year has been about clarity, she said. About understanding what truly serves the family. My sister squeezed Evan's hand. My father nodded. Judith turned slightly, angling her body toward Claire, then toward the rest of the table. Your father and I have spent a long time thinking about the future of the house. About legacy. About responsibility. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. We've decided, she continued, that it's time to formalize things. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Not a speech, not sentiment, paper. We met with our attorney last month, she said calmly. And we've updated our will. No one spoke. I felt my pulse in my ears. The house, she said, and the adjoining property will pass solely to Claire. The room reacted before I did. Gasps, smiles. Someone said how wonderful that was. I looked at my sister. She didn't look surprised. Judith finally turned to me. Natalie. She said, her tone gentle, in a way that felt rehearsed. This isn't a reflection of love. It's about practicality. You've always been independent. Independent, the word families use when they mean expendable. I waited for my father to say something. He didn't. He stared at his plate. I waited for Claire to say something. She smiled apologetically and looked away. Judith raised her glass. To new beginnings, she said, and to choices that protect what matters. Glasses clinked. I sat there, very still, as something old and familiar settled into place. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. This had been decided in private rooms with lawyers and coffee and signatures. I had not been invited because I had never been meant to object. I realized then that every small silence over the years had been practice for this moment. The forgotten birthdays, the way my opinions were acknowledged and then ignored, the way family discussion always happened after I'd left the room. I took a slow breath. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just watched them celebrate a future that no longer included me. And somewhere between the clink of crystal and my mother's satisfied smile, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't the first thing they'd taken from me. It was just the first time they'd done it out loud. At the end of the table, Evan glanced at me. Just once. There was calculation in his eyes. Not pity, not guilt. Assessment. I looked back at him, calm, composed, already deciding something that would change all of their lives. Because what my family didn't know yet was this: the house wasn't the only thing tied up in that will. And I had already spoken to a lawyer of my own. The truth was coming, just not the way they expected. I left my parents' house that night without a scene. That part always disappoints people when I tell this story. They expect tears, raised voices, a slammed door. But I've learned something about families like mine. They're prepared for emotion. They're not prepared for composure. So I hugged my aunt. I congratulated my sister again. I thanked my mother for dinner. I even smiled at Evan, who looked mildly relieved, as if my calm confirmed whatever narrative he'd already built about me. I drove home alone, through the dark, the Christmas lights blurring into long streaks along the highway. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I just replayed the toast in my head over and over until the words lost their sting and became data. That was the night I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. Because here's the truth: no one ever tells you about being excluded. It rarely comes out of nowhere. It's the final move in a game that's been running quietly for years. I grew up being told I was the strong one. Claire was sensitive, emotional, needed reassurance. I was capable, rational. "You'll be fine," my parents used to say whenever something went wrong for me, as if resilience were an excuse to offer less. When Claire forgot her college application deadline, my father made phone calls. When I missed out on a scholarship because I didn't know it existed, I was told I should have been more proactive. When Claire's first engagement fell apart, my mother flew to Boston to support her. When my marriage ended, 3 years later, Judith suggested I take a few days to myself and then move forward. I moved forward all the time. What I didn't do was ask questions. And that was my mistake. The house on Crestview Lane wasn't just my childhood home. It sat on 3 acres, backed by protected woodland. The property had been in my mother's family for 2 generations. My grandmother, Evelyn Brooks, had been explicit about one thing before she died: divide it fairly. She had told us all at Thanksgiving years ago. No favorites. I've seen what that does. I remembered that clearly, so clearly that when my mother announced the will, change, my shock wasn't emotional. It was logistical, because you can't just erase an heir without a reason. And I knew there was more. 2 days after Christmas, I sat in my apartment with a yellow legal pad and started writing things down. Dates, conversations, moments that hadn't made sense at the time. The remodel Claire and Evan had suggested for the East Wing. The way my mother had suddenly insisted on handling all family finances herself. The fact that my father had stopped signing checks. Patterns started to emerge. I called my old college friend, Marissa Feldman. She'd gone to law school Later in life, after a messy divorce and a decade in HR, we'd kept in touch sporadically, mostly holiday cards and the occasional coffee when I was back in town. When I told her what had happened, she didn't interrupt. She listened. Then she said, "Natalie, did your parents explain how the will was changed?" "No," I said. "They just announced it." "Did you see a copy?" "No." "Did they mention your grandmother's trust?" I went quiet. There had been a trust. I remembered it vaguely. Set up when my grandfather died. My mother had always brushed off questions about it, saying it was complicated and handled. Marissa sighed softly. "Judith always did like control," she said. That made me laugh. Once, short, sharp, Marissa offered to review whatever documents I could get my hands on. The problem was, I didn't have access. Or, at least, that's what my mother assumed. What she forgot was that I used to help my father with his bookkeeping when I was in high school. He'd taught me how to file things, how to track statements, how to keep copies. I knew where they kept the old safe. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't confront anyone. I waited. 3 weeks later, my father called. His voice sounded tired, smaller than I remembered. "Your mother says you've been distant," he said. "I've been busy," I replied. Which was true. He hesitated. "She's under a lot of stress. The wedding planning, the legal paperwork." There it was. "What legal paperwork?" I asked lightly. Silence. Then he cleared his throat. "Estate planning. You know." I did know. And I knew something else too. My father didn't sound in control. He sounded managed. That night, after we hung up, I booked an appointment with an estate attorney in Stamford. His name was Paul Henderson. Late 50s, calm, expensive. I brought him what little I had. My grandmother's old letters, a photocopy of the trust summary I'd kept without realizing its value. Notes, dates. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Your parents can change their will," he said. "But trusts are different, especially irrevocable ones." My stomach tightened. "Your grandmother's trust," he continued, "was designed to protect beneficiaries from exactly this kind of manipulation." "Beneficiaries," I repeated, plural. "Yes," he said. "You and your sister." I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief. Not yet. "Can they remove me?" I asked. "Not without cause," Paul said. "And not without documentation. And if they try," he smiled faintly, "then they've created a paper trail." I walked out of that office into the cold January air with a strange sense of calm. Because here was the thing. My family thought they'd acted quietly. They thought silence was the same as consent. They thought I'd accept exclusion the way I always had. With grace, with distance, with disappearance. What they didn't realize was that I had stopped trying to belong. And when you stop needing approval, you start seeing leverage. That was when I understood the real shift hadn't happened at the dinner table. It had happened when I didn't argue, when I didn't beg, when I let them think the story was finished. Because I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing a correction. And they hadn't even noticed the game had changed. People assume silence means weakness. In my family, silence was currency. It was how decisions were made without discussion, how discomfort was smoothed over, how inconvenient truths were buried under manners and casseroles. I had been fluent in it since childhood, so when weeks passed, without me mentioning the will, my mother relaxed. She started calling again. Not often, just enough to test the waters. Casual updates, seating choices for the wedding, color schemes. A question about whether I still had my grandmother's silver candlesticks, the ones she'd given me years ago to keep safe. I told her yes. She didn't ask why I hadn't brought them back. That was the thing about Judith. She liked outcomes. She didn't like explanations. I let her talk. I let her assume. I answered in short, neutral sentences that gave her nothing to push against. No emotion, no challenge. Inside, I was busy. Paul Henderson had asked me to be patient. Not passive, patient. People who manipulate assets. He told me during our second meeting, tend to overreach once they think the coast is clear. He was right. In early February, Claire invited me to lunch. It was the first time she'd reached out directly since Christmas. We met at a bistro near her office in White Plains, neutral territory. She arrived late, flushed already talking before she sat down. Wedding stress, she said. Evan's parents. The venue. The florist. I listened, stirred my coffee, let her fill the space. Eventually she paused. Mom says you've been quiet. I've been busy, I said again. She frowned slightly. You're not upset, are you? I looked at her then. Really looked. Claire had always been good at appearing concerned, without actually offering anything. I'm paying attention, I said. Her shoulders relaxed, just a little. That's good, she said quickly. Because Mom was worried you might misunderstand things. I said nothing. She leaned forward, lowered her voice. You know this isn't personal, right? The house thing. It's just, Evan and I are building a future. You don't have kids. You're not tied down. There it was, the logic they all shared, but never said out loud. I took a sip of coffee, let the silence stretch. You'll always be part of the family, she added, as if that settled something. I smiled. Small, polite. Of course, I said. She exhaled relieved, reached for her phone. She didn't notice me watching her hand shake as she texted Evan under the table. That lunch told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just excluding me. They were justifying it. Out loud. To each other. And justification always precedes entitlement. 2 weeks later, my father emailed me. Not called, emailed. The subject line read, trust documents. He wrote that Judith had suggested consolidating old paperwork and wanted to know if I still had any copies related to Grandma Evelyn's estate. He asked if I could send them for record keeping. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I said I'd look. I did not send anything. Instead, I forwarded the email to Paul. His response came back within an hour. They're fishing, he wrote. Do not give them originals. Do not confirm what you have. Let them wonder. So I did. Days passed. Then another email. More insistent. Less polite. Then Judith called. Her voice was tight. Controlled. Your father says you haven't responded properly, she said. We're trying to organize things responsibly, Natalie. I'm not sure what you need, I said calmly. There was a pause. A recalibration. Well, she said it would help if you'd stop being difficult. There it was. The moment where politeness cracked. I'm not being difficult, I said. I'm being careful. She laughed. Short, sharp, careful about what? About my interests, I said. Silence. I could almost hear her thinking, calculating. Natalie, she said finally, this isn't a negotiation. No, I agreed. It's documentation. She hung up. That night, Paul called me himself. That wasn't typical. They've contacted their attorney again, he said, trying to amend the trust structure. Can they? I asked. They can try, he said. But here's the thing. Your grandmother included a clause that requires beneficiary notification for material changes. My chest tightened. They didn't notify you, he continued, which means any attempt they make without your acknowledgement is contestable. I closed my eyes. For years, I said slowly, they made decisions without me. Yes, Paul said, but not legally. That distinction mattered more than anything. A week later, Evan reached out. That surprised me. He suggested coffee, casual, framed as wanting to clear the air. I agreed. We met near his office. He was polished calm, smiling too much. He talked about the wedding, about family, about how misunderstandings happen. Then he leaned back and said, I think your mother's just trying to do what's best. For whom I asked. He didn't answer directly. He never did. Instead, he said, there's no need for things to get complicated. I met his eyes. Complicated for who I asked again. He held my gaze this time, measured me. You know, he said carefully, when assets are involved, people start making assumptions. I agree, I said. They assume silence means agreement. His jaw tightened. I finished my coffee and stood. "Tell Claire congratulations," I said. "I hope everything works out." I walked out before he could respond. As I stepped into the cold, my phone buzzed. A message from Paul. "They filed paperwork," it read. "And they made a mistake." I stopped walking. "What kind of mistake?" I typed back. "The kind that only happens when people think they've already won." I smiled. For the first time since Christmas, it wasn't small. It was deliberate, because now it wasn't just about exclusion. It was about proof, and proof has a way of turning silence into leverage. Paul didn't send details over text. He called. That alone told me this wasn't minor. "They filed an amendment attempt," he said. "Not a full restructuring, more like a workaround." I sat at my kitchen table, notebook open, pen poised. Old habits. Listening without interrupting. "They tried to reclassify the trust's primary asset." He continued, "from residential property to family-managed holding." "That sounds intentional," I said. "It is," Paul replied. "And sloppy." He explained it slowly, carefully, like he knew I needed to hear it in plain language, not legal theater. My grandmother's trust had been set up to protect the house and surrounding land from unilateral decisions. Any major change required acknowledgement from both beneficiaries. Not approval, acknowledgement. Judith's attorney had attempted to shift management authority to a newly formed LLC, Harper Family Holdings. My father listed as managing member, Claire listed as successor. My name wasn't on it at all. They assumed, Paul said, that because the will was updated, the trust would follow. I let that sink in. "They assumed wrong," I said. "Yes," he said. "And more importantly, they documented that assumption." That was the mistake, because intent matters in law. And nothing reveals intent faster than paperwork that pretends someone doesn't exist. Paul told me to do nothing. Again, no objections, no emails, no confrontations. "Let them finish," he said. "People like this don't stop at one move." He was right. Within a month, the changes started showing up in real life. Claire posted engagement photos taken on the back lawn of the house, captioned something about our forever place. Evan's parents toured the property with a contractor. My neighbor from childhood mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars in the drive. Judith called to tell me casually that they were updating a few things before the wedding. "We thought it would be easier," she said, "if we handled it now." "Of course," I replied. She didn't hear the difference between acceptance and observation. What she also didn't know was that Paul had already pulled the filings. Every one of them. Time-stamped, signed, filed without notification. Each one tightened the net. The real shift came when my father called again. This time, he didn't pretend everything was fine. "Your mother's upset," he said quietly. "She thinks you're preparing to challenge the family." "I am the family," I said. He sighed. Deep, heavy. "You know how she gets," he said. "Once, she believes something threatens stability. She creates stability by force." I finished. He didn't disagree. That silence told me more than any defense ever could. "Leonard," I said gently, "did you read the trust before you signed those papers?" A pause. "No," he admitted. "Judith said it was handled." That was the moment something in me hardened. Not anger, clarity. My father wasn't the architect. He was the signature, and signatures carry weight. 2 days later, Paul called again. "They've scheduled a valuation," he said. For what I asked, though, I already knew. The property, he said. Likely preparing to leverage it. Loan, renovation, something tied to the wedding. Without my consent, I said, "Yes." I closed my eyes. That was the point of no return. "Paul," I said, "what happens if I acknowledge the filings now?" "They'd have to stop," he said. "Immediately. Everything freezes until resolution. And if I don't, they keep going," he said. "Which only strengthens your position." I thought about my grandmother, about her insistence on fairness, about the way she used to say, "People tell you who they are when they think no one's watching." They thought I wasn't watching. I decided to wait one more week. That week, Judith stopped calling. Claire sent a message asking if I could return the silver candlesticks. She said they matched the wedding aesthetic. I didn't respond. Evan sent an email asking if I'd be willing to sign off on some paperwork to streamline things. I forwarded it to Paul. His reply came back almost instantly. "They're asking you to waive rights you haven't even asserted yet," he wrote. That's bold. It was also reckless. The following Monday, Paul filed a notice of beneficiary acknowledgement. Not a lawsuit, not a demand, just a formal declaration that I existed. That single document triggered a cascade. Judith's attorney called Paul within hours. Then again. Then emailed. The valuation was paused. The LLC filing flagged. The trust administrator requested clarification. For the first time, the system acknowledged me without my family's permission. That night, my mother showed up at my apartment, unannounced. She stood in the hallway, coat still on, eyes sharp, mouth tight. "You blindsided us," she said. "No," I replied calmly. I responded. She scoffed. "You're making this public." "I didn't speak to anyone," I said. "The paperwork did." She stepped closer, lowered her voice. "You're risking everything," she said. "The wedding, the family, your relationship with us." I met her gaze. "You changed the will without telling me," I said. "You attempted to restructure a trust without acknowledging me. You moved forward, assuming I'd stay silent." Her eyes flickered. "That was your choice," I continued. "This is mine." She stared at me, searching for the daughter who would fold. She didn't find her. "You've always been so difficult," she said finally. I nodded once. "That's what people say," I replied, "when control stops working." She left without another word. An hour later, my father texted. I didn't know he wrote. I should have. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "I believe you." It was the truth. And it didn't change what came next. Because this was no longer about misunderstanding or hurt feelings. It was about exclusion formalized on paper. And now it was about undoing it. Legally, quietly, completely. Once the paperwork paused, the tone changed. That's something I learned quickly. When people believe they're in control, they speak in conclusions. When that control wobbles, they start asking questions disguised as concern. Judith called 3 days after showing up at my apartment. Her voice was softer, almost maternal. "I've been thinking," she said. "This has all gotten so procedural." "It has," I agreed. "That's not how families should operate," she continued. "We should talk. Really talk." I pictured her at the kitchen table in Ridgewood, hands folded neatly, already rehearsing the version of the conversation where she guided me gently back into place. "I'm listening," I said. She suggested lunch. At the house. I declined. We met instead at a cafe halfway between us. Public, neutral, bright. She arrived early, ordered tea, smiled when I walked in like we were old friends catching up after a misunderstanding. We sat. "I never meant to hurt you," she began. "I know," I said. And I did. Hurting me hadn't been the point. Removing friction had. She blinked, recalculated. "You've always been so capable," she said. "So self-sufficient. Claire needs more support. She needs more permission," I said quietly. Her smile tightened. "You're reading into things," she said. "This isn't favoritism. It's practicality." That word again. I leaned back slightly. "Judith, did you intend to notify me before changing the trust structure?" She looked offended. "We didn't change it. We were reorganizing management without acknowledging me. You weren't affected," she said quickly. "Nothing was taken from you." "That's not how the law sees it," I said. Her eyes flashed. "So this is about money," she snapped. "No," I said calmly. "It is about consent." She exhaled sharply. "You're overreacting." I let that sit. Then I said, "Your attorney filed documents that misrepresented beneficiary status." Her teacup paused halfway to her lips. "That's a serious statement," she said. "It's also accurate," I replied. She set the cup down carefully, too carefully. "What do you want?" she asked. There it was, the first honest question she'd asked me in years. "I want transparency," I said. "And I want decisions that involve shared assets to include all parties. Her jaw clenched. And if we refuse, she asked. Then, the trust remains frozen, I said. And any attempt to move around it becomes evidence. She stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. This is what you've become, she said quietly. I didn't rise to it. This is who I've always been, I replied. You just didn't need to notice before. She left early. Didn't touch her tea. That afternoon, Claire called. She sounded frantic. Evan's furious, she said. His parents are asking questions. The wedding planner says things might be delayed. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. And I was. Just not for the reasons she wanted. You could fix this, she insisted. All you have to do is sign the waiver. No, I said. You're being selfish, she said, her voice breaking. This is my future, and I'm not allowed one, I asked. She didn't answer. The silence between us stretched heavy and revealing. That night, Paul forwarded me an email. Judith's attorney had requested mediation. Typical, Paul wrote. They want you in a room where pressure works better than paper. Do we go? I asked. Yes, he replied. On our terms. The mediation was scheduled for the following week. Judith, Leonard, their attorney, Paul, and me. No Claire, no Evan. That alone told me something had shifted. The day before mediation, my father called again. His voice was unsteady. I didn't understand what I was signing, he said. I should have asked you. I know, I said. I feel like I failed you, he whispered. I closed my eyes. I don't need apologies, I said. I need honesty. He exhaled. Your mother believes she's protecting the family. I believe that too, I said. From accountability. He didn't argue. The mediation room was small, neutral, no windows. Judith sat upright, composed. Leonard looked tired, smaller. Their attorney spoke first, framed everything as a misunderstanding, a desire for efficiency. Paul responded with dates, filings, clauses. Facts don't raise their voice. They don't need to. At one point, Judith turned to me. If we acknowledge you formally, she said, will you stop this? I met her gaze. Stop what I asked. She hesitated, protecting myself. I continued. Or protecting the trust. She didn't answer. Paul slid a document across the table. A proposed resolution. Full beneficiary acknowledgement. Suspension of unilateral authority. Independent trust administrator. Judith's face hardened. You're taking control away from us, she said. No, I replied. You're sharing it. Leonard reached for the paper. Read it slowly. Then he signed. Judith stared at him. You're undermining me, she hissed. He looked up. His voice was quiet. I'm correcting something, he said. She didn't sign that day, but the damage was done. Because for the first time, someone had acted without her permission, and she had no legal way to stop it. That night, Claire posted a vague message online about betrayal and family loyalty. People commented, speculated. I didn't respond, because the real shift wasn't public. It was structural, and once structures change, narratives follow. Judith didn't speak to me for almost a month after mediation. Not a text, not an email, nothing. For most of my life, that kind of silence would have hollowed me out. I would have replayed conversations, wondered what I could have said differently, drafted apologies I didn't believe in just to restore equilibrium. This time, the silence felt different. It felt strategic, and strategies always have a cost. The first sign came through my father. He called on a Tuesday evening, later than usual. His voice was careful, like someone walking across thin ice. Your mother's been upset, he said. I assumed, I replied. She feels cornered, he continued, like things are being taken from her. I didn't interrupt. She says you're turning the family into a legal battlefield. I pictured Judith saying it. The phrasing, the moral framing, turning herself into the victim of a process she'd started. Leonard, I said quietly, did you feel cornered when you signed? He paused. No, he admitted. I felt relieved. That told me everything. After that call, small things began to surface. A cousin I was close to stopped returning messages. An aunt canceled lunch plans without explanation. I heard through someone else that Judith had been very emotional at a charity luncheon, telling a story about how painful it was when children lost perspective. I wasn't named. I didn't need to be. This was the price of resistance. Not confrontation, not open warfare, reputation erosion. Families like mine didn't punish loudly. They whispered. Paul had warned me. When control is challenged, he said the next move is isolation. He was right again. The second sign came at work. My supervisor called me into her office one afternoon, her tone professional but cautious. "I just want to check in," she said. "Everything okay outside of work?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" She hesitated. "We received a call, anonymous, expressing concern." "About?" I asked. She chose her words carefully. "Your emotional stability." I sat very still. "Was there anything specific?" I asked. "No," she said quickly. "Nothing actionable. Just vague." I nodded once. I knew exactly where it came from. Judith had always believed that influence worked best sideways, through perception, through suggestion, not accusation, implication. After the meeting, I closed my office door and called Paul. "They're escalating," I said. "Yes," he replied, "but poorly." He explained that anonymous calls without documentation carried no weight, but they revealed intent. And intent, he reminded me, is becoming a pattern. That night, I wrote everything down. Dates, calls, messages, missed invitations, the subtle tightening of social circles. I wasn't collecting grievances. I was documenting behavior. 2 weeks later, Judith made her next move. She sent me an email. Formal, polite, cold. She proposed a buyout. In exchange for relinquishing my beneficiary status in the trust, they would pay me a lump sum. "Fair," she said. "Generous even." Paul reviewed it and laughed. Not humorously, disbelievingly. "She's offering you a fraction of the asset's value," he said, "and asking you to waive future claims." "So she still doesn't get it," I said. "No," he replied. "She thinks money ends this." I declined the offer. Briefly, in writing. The response was immediate. Judith called. Her voice wasn't calm this time. "You're forcing our hand," she said. "I'm responding to yours," I said. "You're tearing the family apart," she snapped. "No," I replied. "I'm refusing to disappear quietly." She went quiet. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You think your grandmother would be proud of this?" I closed my eyes. "My grandmother," I said slowly, "would be proud that I read the documents she put in place to protect us." She hung up. 3 days later, Paul forwarded me another update. Judith had filed a petition, not to remove me, to question my fitness. She was claiming undue influence, emotional instability, suggesting that my divorce, my isolation, and my resistance indicated impaired judgment. It was an old tactic, paint the dissenter as unwell. Paul wasn't concerned. "She's grasping," he said, "and judges don't love this angle unless there's evidence." There wasn't, but it meant things were no longer contained. A hearing was scheduled. Nothing dramatic, preliminary, procedural. Still, it meant standing in a courtroom where my mother would imply I was the problem. I prepared, not emotionally, practically. I requested my employment records, performance reviews, promotions, letters of recommendation. I asked my therapist to provide a statement, factual and limited. I asked Paul to subpoena communication logs. If Judith wanted to question my stability, I would present consistency. The night before the hearing, my father called again. "I never wanted this," he said. "I know," I replied. "She won't stop," he said quietly. "I know," I said again. "I should have stopped her years ago." That was the closest he'd ever come to admitting it. The hearing itself was uneventful. Judith spoke through her attorney, carefully, vaguely. Paul responded with facts. The judge listened, asked a few questions, took notes. At the end, he denied the petition. Firmly. No grounds. No evidence. He also added something else. A recommendation. Independent oversight of the trust given demonstrated familial conflict. That was the moment Judith lost what she valued most. Control without scrutiny. When we walked out, She didn't look at me. Leonard did. His eyes were wet, tired, grateful. I nodded once. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. That night, Claire finally texted, "You didn't have to take it this far." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I didn't," I wrote. "You watched it go this far." She didn't respond. And for the first time, I didn't chase the silence, because I understood now. Every system resists change before it breaks. And my family was deep in resistance. But resistance isn't strength. It's fear. And fear makes people reckless, which meant this wasn't over yet. But it was turning. And this time, I wasn't the one losing ground. By the time spring arrived, the wedding had become an open wound no one wanted to touch. The date was still set. The venue still booked. But everything else moved with hesitation. Deposits paused. Plans revised. Conversations lowered the moment someone walked into a room. Control had slipped, and without it, Judith didn't know how to perform. I heard most of it secondhand. Through cousins, through my father's careful updates, through the way my absence was suddenly noticeable. Claire stopped posting about the wedding. Evan's parents, once enthusiastic, became distant. They asked questions about the property, about the trust, about governance. Questions that didn't have flattering answers. That's what happens when alliances are built on assets instead of trust. The independent administrator, a woman named Ruth Kaplan, reached out to me directly. Professional, direct, neutral. She requested a meeting to review the trust structure and clarify beneficiary expectations. I appreciated that she didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I knew. We met in her office in New Haven. Glass walls, clean lines, no pretense. "I want to be clear," she said. "My role is to ensure compliance and protect all beneficiaries equally." "I don't need favors," I replied. "I need accuracy." She smiled slightly. "Good. We went through everything. The original trust, the attempted amendments, the LLC filings, the paused valuation." At the end, she leaned back. "Your grandmother was meticulous," she said. She anticipated conflict. I nodded. She lived it. Ruth confirmed what Paul had already told me. No asset movement without dual acknowledgement. No unilateral leverage. No exclusion without cause. And she added something else. Any continued attempt to circumvent the trust, she said, could expose your parents to liability. That was new. It meant Judith wasn't just blocked. She was at risk. 2 days later, Judith called me. Her voice was controlled, but the edges were frayed. "You spoke to the administrator," she said. "Yes," I replied. "You went behind our backs." "No," I said. "I went where the trust directs all parties to go." She exhaled sharply. "You're enjoying this," she accused. I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said honestly. "I'm stabilizing it." She laughed brittle. "You've always wanted to prove you're smarter than us." I let that pass. "Evan's parents are asking questions," she said suddenly. "Uncomfortable ones." "I imagine they would," I replied. "You've put us in an impossible position," she snapped. "You put yourself there," I said. By assuming silence meant surrender. She didn't respond. Then she said something quieter. "They're reconsidering." I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. "I won't be your scapegoat," I said. "Not to secure a wedding." Her voice sharpened again. "So you'd ruin your sister's future." I felt the familiar tug, the old reflex to absorb blame. I resisted it. "Claire's future isn't mine to sacrifice for," I said. That was the line she couldn't cross. She hung up. A week later, Evan asked to meet. Not coffee, not casual. His office? I agreed. He didn't waste time. "This situation is making my family uneasy," he said. "They don't like instability." "Neither do I replied. "They see this as unresolved," he continued. "And frankly, unnecessary." I folded my hands in my lap. "Then you should resolve it," I said. "With you," he clarified. "Yes," I agreed. He leaned forward. "If you step back," he said, "if you formally relinquish your claim, this all goes away." "And if I don't?" I asked. He hesitated. "Then we have to reconsider some things." I studied his face. He wasn't threatening me. He was negotiating. And that told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. Evan, I said, did you ask yourself why my presence destabilizes this much? He frowned. This isn't about you, he said. It is, I replied, because your future depends on me being quiet. He sat back. I think you underestimate what you're risking, he said. I think you underestimate what I already lost, I replied. He stood. End of meeting. 2 days later, Claire showed up at my apartment. No warning. She looked smaller than I remembered. Tired. Eyes red. I didn't know it would get like this, she said. I know, I replied. She sat heavily on my couch. They're fighting all the time, she said. Evan's parents think our family is complicated. I waited. They're asking if this is what marriage into our family looks like. I still waited. Mom says if you just let it go. I interrupted gently. Claire, I said if this requires me to disappear, it's not stability. It's a lie. She cried then, quietly, messy. I don't want to choose, she whispered. I nodded. That's the problem, I said. She stayed a long time. Didn't ask me to sign anything. Didn't apologize. When she left, she hugged me tightly. For the first time in years. The wedding didn't survive the month. The official explanation was scheduling conflicts. The real one was harder to say out loud. Evan's family withdrew. No accusations. No drama. Just distance. And distance does more damage than confrontation ever could. Judith didn't call after that. Not once. My father did. His voice was steady. They're selling the idea of postponement, he said. Saving face. I understand, I replied. I want you to know, he added. I don't regret signing. Neither did I. Because what fell apart wasn't a wedding. It was an illusion built on exclusion. And illusions collapse when they're asked to carry weight. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And it wasn't finished yet. Because when people lose control publicly, they often try to reclaim it privately. And Judith was not done trying. When people lose power in public, they try to regain it in private. Judith didn't rage. She didn't plead. She didn't apologize. She reset. That was her talent. When a narrative failed, she rewrote it and acted as if the previous version had never existed. New tone, new language, same objective. The first sign was a letter, handwritten, thick stationery, my name written carefully on the envelope, like she wanted the effort to be noticed. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for 2 days, long enough for curiosity to fade and intention to sharpen. When I finally read it, the tone was almost gentle. She wrote about family, about time passing, about how conflict distorts memory. She said she wanted peace, that she didn't recognize the hostility anymore, that she missed me. Not once did she mention the trust. Not once did she mention the will. Not once did she mention accountability. The letter ended with an invitation to dinner. Just the 3 of us. Her, my father, and me. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I called Paul. She's trying to reset without resolving, he said, after I read it to him. That's not reconciliation. That's containment. She wants me back inside the system, I said. Yes, he replied. Before the next phase. What's the next phase, I asked. She'll try to move assets again, he said, but more quietly. I declined the dinner. Politely. Briefly. Her response came within hours. Another email. Shorter. Less warm. She said she was disappointed. That she'd hoped I'd choose healing over hostility. I didn't reply. Instead, I met with Ruth Kaplan again. She had requested updated statements from all parties. Routine, she said. Standard oversight. Judith had submitted hers early. I could imagine her eagerness. The belief that cooperation might regain favor. Ruth looked over her glasses at me as we sat down. She's requesting discretionary authority, she said. Again, I asked. Yes, Ruth replied. Framed as efficiency. And I asked. And I declined, she said. Formally. I exhaled slowly. Ruth slid another document across the table. This, she said, is more concerning. It was a request to classify certain trust expenses as family support, legal language, broad definitions, wedding planning, renovation costs, consultant fees. All tied to the property, Ruth explained, but benefiting specific individuals. She's trying to expense her way around consent, I said. Yes, Ruth replied. And she's assuming you won't object. I object, I said. Ruth nodded. Good, because now it's documented. 2 days later, my father called. Judith had confronted him, accused him of siding with me, of undermining her authority, of embarrassing the family. He sounded exhausted. She says everything was easier when you stayed out of it, he said quietly. I stayed out because I was excluded, I replied. I know, he said, and I let it happen. That was the first time he'd said it without qualifiers. That night, Claire texted. She's blaming you for everything, she wrote. The wedding, the money, the tension. I know, I replied. She wants you to apologize, Claire added, just to smooth things over, for what I asked. There was a long pause. I don't know, she finally wrote. That was the most honest answer she'd ever given me. A week later, Judith made her move. Not directly, not publicly. She contacted my ex-husband. I found out when he called me confused. She asked me questions, he said, about your mental state when you divorced, about whether you'd ever acted impulsively. I closed my eyes. She framed it as concern, he added, but it felt off. I thanked him for telling me. Then I called Paul. That crosses a line, he said. Yes, I replied. And now it's evidence, because here was the thing Judith never understood. Influence only works in silence. The moment it's documented, it becomes exposure. Paul sent a formal notice that afternoon, cease and desist regarding third-party contact, preservation of records, warning of harassment implications. Judith didn't respond. Instead, she sent another letter. This one was colder. She accused me of poisoning relationships, of escalating unnecessarily, of forcing her hand. I read it once. Then I put it in the file with everything else, because by then I understood the pattern. When control fails, manipulation escalates. When manipulation fails, desperation follows. And desperation makes people careless. I wasn't angry anymore. I was observant, because something was coming. And when it did, I intended to be ready. Not with words, with documents. The document arrived on a Thursday, not by email, not through Paul, by courier. That alone made my stomach tighten. It was addressed to me by name, my full legal name typed cleanly on a white envelope with no return address. Inside was a copy of a filing I was never meant to see. A petition. Judith had submitted it quietly to the probate court 2 counties over, attempting to accelerate a partial distribution of trust-managed assets under the claim of family necessity. It was dated 10 days earlier. She hadn't told Ruth, she hadn't told Paul, she hadn't told my father, and she certainly hadn't told me. What made my hands go cold wasn't the request itself. It was the attachment, a sworn statement signed by Judith, claiming that I had verbally agreed to step aside from trust matters and allow Claire to assume sole beneficiary responsibility for the sake of family harmony. I stared at the page for a long time. The signature was real. The statement was not. This wasn't manipulation anymore. This was falsification. I called Paul immediately. He didn't speak for several seconds after I read it to him. Then he said very calmly, "Do not contact her." "I wasn't planning to," I replied. "This," he continued, "is no longer a family matter. This is fraud." I sat down. Paul explained what had happened. Judith's attorney had likely warned her against this, which meant she may have filed it independently or with selective disclosure. Either way, it was a material misrepresentation. And worse, the court stamp showed the filing had been accepted pending review, meaning it had entered the system. "This changes the timeline," Paul said, "and the leverage." "What happens now?" I asked. "We respond," he said, decisively. Within hours, Paul had drafted a response. Affidavit denying consent. Timeline of events. Documentation of prior filings. Copies of emails. Records of mediation. Proof of my continued objection. And then he added something I hadn't expected. A motion to compel a full forensic review of trust-related actions taken over the past 18 months. I felt my breath catch. That's extensive, I said. Yes, he replied, and necessary. Because a forensic review doesn't just look at intent. It looks at behavior, patterns, transfers, communications. It opens doors people assumed were closed. Paul filed everything the next morning. By Monday, the court had issued a temporary stay. All trust-related actions were frozen. Again, this time with judicial oversight. Judith called me that afternoon. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Her voice was tight-clipped, controlled, in a way that told me she was barely holding it together. "You've gone too far," she said. "This was never meant to become public. Withdraw it." I saved the message. Then she called again. And again. I didn't answer. That evening, my father came to my apartment. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. "I didn't know," he said as soon as he sat down. "I swear I didn't." "I know," I replied. "She told me it was procedural," he said. "That you'd agreed." I met his eyes. "I didn't," I said. He nodded slowly. "I believe you." Then he did something that surprised me. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. "These," he said, "are copies of everything I've signed in the past 2 years." My chest tightened. "I should have kept them sooner," he said. "But I didn't think I needed to protect myself from my own wife." I took the folder. Inside were signatures, dates, authorizations. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Paul would. "Leonard," I said quietly, "this matters." "I know," he replied. "And I won't lie again." That night, Claire texted. Not angry. Panicked. "Mom's saying you're trying to destroy her," she wrote. "That you're making false accusations." I typed slowly. "She filed a false statement," I replied. "The court will decide what happens next." There was a long pause. Then, "Did you really never agree?" "No," I wrote. "Not once." Another pause. "Then she told me you had." That was the moment I knew. Judith hadn't just lied to the court. She'd lied to everyone. The forensic review began quietly. Requests for records, emails, bank statements, attorney communications. Ruth called me to confirm cooperation. "This is serious," she said. "You understand that?" "I do," I replied. "I didn't start it." "No," she said. "But you ended the silence." Judith stopped calling after that. Her attorney didn't. He contacted Paul, attempting to negotiate withdrawal. Paul refused. "This isn't about compromise anymore," he said. "It's about accuracy." The review uncovered things faster than anyone expected. Expense reimbursements classified improperly. Emails instructing third parties to proceed as discussed without acknowledgement. Drafts of documents that had never been shared. And then a week later, the worst one. An email from Judith to her attorney, written months before Christmas. "If Natalie becomes an obstacle," it read, "we will need to proceed without her awareness." I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, because I needed to accept it. That was intent, clear, documented, undeniable. Paul called me after he received it. "This is the turning point," he said. "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," he replied. "Because once intent is established, everything changes." This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about exclusion as strategy. And strategies don't survive exposure. The court scheduled a hearing. Full attendance required. Judith would have to answer questions. Under oath. For the first time in her life, she wouldn't be able to manage the narrative. And I wouldn't have to say a word. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand columns, no dramatic echo. Just beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a judge who looked like he'd seen every version of family betrayal imaginable and was no longer impressed by any of it. Judith arrived 10 minutes late, not flustered, not apologetic, composed, hair perfect, jewelry understated but intentional. She took her seat beside her attorney and didn't look at me. My father sat 2 rows behind me. Claire sat next to him, rigid hands clenched in her lap. Paul leaned over and whispered, "Let the documents do the talking." That was the plan. The judge began by summarizing the issue. Calm, precise, no emotion. He referenced the attempted trust amendments. The unauthorized filings. The sworn statement claiming my consent. Then he looked directly at Judith. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "did your daughter ever verbally, or in writing, agree to relinquish her beneficiary status?" Judith didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "She did." The lie landed cleanly. I didn't react. Paul stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to enter Exhibit C." The email, the one Judith had written months before Christmas. The courtroom went very quiet as the judge read. His eyes moved slowly, carefully, line by line. When he finished, he looked up. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "is this your email?" Judith's attorney leaned in, whispering urgently. Judith nodded, "Yes." "And in this email," the judge continued, "you state that if your daughter becomes an obstacle, you would proceed without her awareness." Judith opened her mouth. The judge raised a hand. "Yes or no?" "Yes," she said. The silence that followed was heavy. The judge turned to the sworn statement. "You signed an affidavit claiming consent," he said, "knowing this email existed." Judith swallowed. "Yes," she said. I felt Claire's breath hitch behind me. The judge leaned back. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "that is a material misrepresentation to the court." Her attorney shifted uncomfortably. Paul didn't move. He didn't need to. The judge continued. "Additionally," he said, "the forensic review indicates repeated attempts to circumvent trust requirements, including expense misclassification and unauthorized third-party contact." He looked at Judith steadily. "This court does not look kindly on attempts to erase a beneficiary." Erase. The word landed harder than any accusation. Judith finally looked at me then, not angry, afraid. Her attorney requested a recess. The judge denied it. Instead, he issued his ruling. Immediate removal of Judith as acting authority over any trust-related matters. Permanent, independent administration. Mandatory ethics review of filings. Referral to the state bar regarding potential misconduct. And then the part that changed everything. Given the demonstrated pattern, the judge said this court recommends equalized distribution safeguards to prevent future exclusion. In plain terms, they could never try this again. The gavel came down. Judith's hands shook as she gathered her papers. My father didn't move. Claire stared straight ahead, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Outside the courtroom, Judith finally spoke to me. "You did this?" she said, her voice low, venomous. I looked at her calmly. "No," I said. "I documented it." She turned away. Paul placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "It's over," he said. But he was wrong. It wasn't over. Because when the system stops protecting someone, the personal reckoning begins. And Judith had just lost the only language she knew how to speak. Control. And people who lose control don't walk away quietly. They unravel. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly, the way truth does, when it no longer needs permission. For a few days after the hearing, no one called. No messages. No accusations. Just a sudden, unnatural stillness, as if the entire family had collectively stopped breathing. Judith disappeared. Not literally, but socially. Charities she chaired, quietly, removed her name from event pages. Luncheons she once dominated went on without her. People who had once hovered around her orbit found polite reasons to be elsewhere. Control attracts loyalty. Accountability repels it. My father called on the fourth day. His voice sounded lighter, not happy, but unburdened. "She's staying with her sister," he said. "Says she needs space." I pictured Judith in a guest room somewhere, surrounded by unfamiliar walls, no system to manage, no audience to command. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And I meant it." "She blames you," he added quietly. "I know," I replied. "She always will." I didn't argue. Blame was how she avoided reflection. I had spent too many years absorbing it to take it personally now. Claire came next. She showed up at my apartment one evening, with no warning, no makeup, no practiced composure. She looked untethered. "I didn't know," she said, the moment I opened the door. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat on the couch, hands twisting together. "She told me you agreed," Claire said. "She told me you wanted out, that you didn't care." I sat across from her. "She told me a lot of things," Claire continued. "About you, about Dad, about everyone." I waited. She said controlling the situation was the only way to protect the family. "And what do you think now?" I asked. She swallowed. "I think she was protecting herself." That was as close as she could get to naming it. "I don't know who I am without her managing everything," Claire admitted. "I don't know how to decide things on my own." I nodded slowly. "That's not your fault," I said. "But it is your responsibility now." She cried then. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly, like someone finally realizing the cost of comfort. "I'm not asking you to fix this," she said. I needed you to know I see it now." I believed her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to rescue her from it. That was growth, mine. 2 weeks later, Paul called with the final updates. Judith's attorney had withdrawn. The ethics review was ongoing. The trust was stabilized under permanent third-party oversight. "She can't touch it," Paul said. "Ever again." "And the will I asked?" "Still valid," he replied, "but heavily scrutinized now. Any changes will be examined." In other words, the games were over. At work, the air felt lighter. The anonymous concern had been quietly dismissed. My supervisor apologized for even mentioning it. Promotions resumed discussion. My name was no longer followed by whispers. Truth has a way of cleaning rooms it never enters. One afternoon, I received a letter, not from Judith, from my grandmother's old friend, Margaret Lewis, a woman I hadn't seen in years. She wrote that she'd heard about the court ruling, that my grandmother had once confided worries about Judith's need for control, that she'd hoped I would be strong enough to stand when the time came. "I think Evelyn would be proud," the letter ended. I sat with that for a long time, because pride, when it comes, honestly, feels different than approval. It doesn't ask you to shrink. It lets you stand exactly where you are. The last contact came unexpectedly. Judith emailed me. No accusation, no apology. Just one sentence. "You didn't have to humiliate me." I stared at it for a long time before responding. "I didn't," I wrote. "I refused to disappear." She never replied. And that was fine, because the story wasn't about reconciliation. It was about release. I didn't win. I reclaimed my time, my name, my right to exist without permission. The trust would distribute fairly when the time came. The house would no longer be a weapon. The silence would no longer be compulsory. And for the first time, I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Love that requires erasure is not love. It's control. And choosing yourself is not betrayal. It's survival. The house on Crestview Lane looked the same the last time I saw it. White siding, blue shutters, the old oak tree leaning slightly to the left, just like it always had. But standing at the edge of the driveway, months later, I understood something I never had before. Places don't hold power. People give it to them. Ruth Kaplan had asked if I wanted to be present for the final inventory walkthrough. Not required. Optional. She framed it as closure, not obligation. I agreed. We walked the property together on a quiet October morning. No ceremony, no audience, just documentation, measurements, notes, photos. When we stepped into the living room, I felt a brief tightening in my chest. Not grief, recognition. This was where I had learned to stay quiet, to read the room, to sense when my presence was inconvenient. And this was where that version of me stopped existing. Ruth noticed my pause but didn't comment. That's what real respect looks like. It doesn't demand explanation. Outside, she closed her folder and said, "Everything is in order. The trust will proceed exactly as written. Fair, balanced, immutable." When I got back to my car, I sat for a moment, with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing in the cool air. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. It became honest. My father and I rebuilt something quietly. Not a fantasy of what we should have been, but a reality of what we could be now. Short calls, occasional lunches, no pretense. Claire moved into her own apartment for the first time. She started therapy. We talked carefully, without sliding back into old roles. I didn't guide her. I didn't save her. I let her grow. Judith stayed distant. I heard through someone else that she'd taken a step back from public life, that she was rethinking priorities, that she told people she'd been misunderstood. That was fine. Understanding was no longer my responsibility. At work, I accepted a new role. More responsibility, less apology. I stopped shrinking my achievements so others could feel comfortable around them. And the strangest thing happened. Without the constant pressure to manage my family's emotions, my life got quieter, not emptier, clearer. One evening, months later, I sat alone in my apartment paperwork, neatly filed away, the trust no longer looming over every thought. The window was open. The city hummed softly outside. I thought back to that Christmas Eve, to the toast, to the folder on the table, to the moment I realized I'd been excluded as a matter of strategy, not circumstance. If I had one thing to say to the woman I was, then it would be this: you are not difficult. You are not selfish. You are not dramatic for noticing when the rules only apply to you. And silence is not peace when it costs you your place. I didn't expose my family to punish them. I told the truth because living inside their version of harmony was erasing me. The real revenge wasn't court rulings or consequences or watching control slip through someone else's fingers. The real revenge was choosing myself without asking permission, setting boundaries that didn't require explanation, refusing to be the quiet one so everyone else could stay comfortable. If you're listening to this and you've ever sat at a holiday table feeling smaller than you did the year before, if you've been labeled independent when what they meant was disposable, if you've been excluded from decisions that shaped your own life, I want you to know this. You don't need to scream to reclaim your dignity. You don't need to beg to be included. And you don't need to stay silent to be loved. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop participating in a system that survives by diminishing you. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. You're not alone, even when it feels like family has made you invisible. And if you want more stories about revenge, family drama, betrayal, inheritance battles, and the quiet power of taking your life back, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Because choosing yourself isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of one that finally belongs to you.